Hey, want a cookie? Oh, I know you just ate, so you're craving something a little sweet. Besides, one cookie isn't gonna kill you. How about half? Just a bite? Bite it. Bite it. Bite it.
Food noise isn't fair, but Mochi Health is. Your affordable GLP-1 source that puts you on a path to successful weight loss by quieting food noise.
Bite it.
Shh. Learn more at joinmochi.com. Mochi members have access to licensed physicians and nutritionists. Results may vary.
Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, back again for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the history of Pulps, the precursor to American comic books. Before comic books exploded onto the scene in the early 20th century, one of the most prominent forms of entertainment was pulp magazines. Made of cheap pulp paper with extravagant covers, they told stories across all genres, from adventure to romance. It was in pulps that writers like Robert E. Howard, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert Heinlein would find their beginnings, along with classic characters like The Shadow, Tarzan, Conan, and Zorro, who not only survive to this day, but inspire many classic comic book characters, from Superman to Batman. However, the very medium pulps would inspire would also lead to its downfall, though the style of stories they are told continue to this day. Pulps ran from the 1890s to the 1950s and would eventually consist of 900 separate titles and 40,000 individual issues before their demise. They were the primary form of inexpensive entertainment in America for the first half of the 20th century. They took their name from the coarse, cheap wood pulp paper used for the interior content, usually having rough, untrimmed edges. Their covers, though, were usually printed on glossy non-pulp stock that allowed for full-color printing. Typically, they were bound in 16-page signatures with a total page count of 128 to 144 pages, with dimensions of a 7 by 10 inches to 8.5 by 11.5 inches. For the most part, this was the American phenomenon, though many were reprinted or printed overseas. Their main competition on the newsstands were the Slicks or the Glossies, magazines printed on higher quality paper, thus the name Slick and Glossy, which included Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, and Cosmopolitan, whose stories were considered more high-minded. Pulp magazines gave rise to the term pulp fiction as well, referring to the run-of-the-mill, low-quality stories, and they were the successors of dime novels, penny dreadfuls, and the short fiction magazines of the early 19th century. The first pulp was created by Frank M. Mumsey, a newspaper and magazine publisher, who in 1882 published the Golden Argosy, a thin, dime novel magazine meant to be an illustrated weekly paper for boys. It was so successful he launched another magazine, Munsey Weekly, in 1891. 2 years later, Munsey had it renamed Munsey's Magazine, expanding its size and turning it into a monthly release, becoming another huge hit. Meanwhile, the Argosy, originally the Golden Argosy before being retitled in 1888, was struggling to find its niche, going through a series of format changes. Finally, Munsey was inspired to make it an all-fiction magazine in October of 1896 and would see its circulation soar from 40,000 issues to 500,000. By December of 1896, Munsey had the magazine printed on pulp paper, replacing its original higher quality stock, and as a result, some consider this the first true pulp magazine. Munsey would further expand his new pulp line with All Story magazine in January of 1905, which was a general fiction adventure pulp with full-color cover illustrations. The stories in these magazines covered all genres, from romance to adventure to science fiction. Munsey did get more specialized with Railroad Men's magazine in October of 1906, devoted to the tales of railroad and the first pulp to focus on a single genre. This was followed by The Ocean on October of 1907, which was later renamed Livewire after 11 issues, only to be finally canceled after another 7. In 1908, Munsey added The Cavalier to much greater success, and that magazine would run for 163 issues before merging with All Story Weekly in 1914. For 7 years, Frank Munsey had this new pulp field all to himself until Street & Smith, a New York paperback and magazine publisher founded in 1855, joined in with the popular magazine in November of 1903. However, Street & Smith had an added twist to their magazine, with Popular featuring full-color illustrated covers instead of the original words and black and white line drawings that Munsey was using. In response, the Argosy under Munsey would start color illustrations in October of 1905, though didn't go full color until December of 1912. Street & Smith followed with Top Notch magazine in March of 1910, which would switch to a pulp format on October 1st of that year, running for more than 25 years in 1930 to 1937. On October of 1915, Street & Smith published Detective Story magazine, starting the detective pulp genre. And then they would start two more genres, romance and sports, in Pulps with Love Story magazine on August of 1921, followed by Sports Story magazine in 1923. Street and Smith would also later create another pulp genre in the 1930s with The Shadow in 1931, bringing about the hero pulps. Another publisher who entered the pulp medium was Story Press, who released a monthly story magazine in May of 1905. On October of 1906, it became the monthly story Blue Book magazine, eventually becoming one of the most prestigious and longest-running pulps ever made. From May of 1907 to January of 1952, it will be known as the Blue Book magazine, Blue Book, and Blue Book of Fiction and Adventure. And in the 1920s, it is considered one of the big four of pulps, next to Adventure, Argosy, and short stories. And by the 1930s, it was called the King of Pulps. Writers that contributed to Blue Book included Edgar Rice Burroughs and Agatha Christie, while interior artists included Alex Raymond, the creator of Flash Gordon. Another of the big four pulps was Short Stories, which was made into a pulp in March of 1910, originally beginning as a more literary Slick magazine back in 1890. The magazine was advertised as 25 stories for 25 cents, emphasizing the cheapness of the pulp entertainment, one of its main appeals. It was originally known for Western stories written by the likes of Max Brand and Ernest Haycox, but would also expand to adventure and humor. The magazine adapted a red sun as its symbol, which appeared on nearly every one of its covers, and by 1922, its circulation peaked at 899,000 copies per issue. In September of 1950, it published Robert Heinlein's novella Destination Moon, an adaptation of his screenplay for the film of the same name. Short Stories was later published by Doubleday and Page Incorporated and would run for nearly 1,000 issues to 1959. Adventure stories were the most popular of the pulps, with 140 titles. Argosy ran for 1,500 issues over 46 years. The final of the Big Four pulps that was published was on November of 1910, when Ridgway, an offshoot of the Butterick Publishing Company, released Adventure, having already published the Slick Everybody's. It would soon become the king of adventure pulps, in large part under the editorial direction of Arthur Sullivan Hoffman, who ran the magazine from 1912 to 1927. Under Hoffman, a cadre of talented writers covered various adventure subgenres, from mystery to hobo, and he also had a talented assistant, Sinclair Lewis, who would later become the first writer from the United States to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1930, who created a popular identification card for readers, in which, if the bearer died, it informed whoever found it to turn it over to his next of kin of this hapless adventurer. In 1934, Adventure was brought on by Popular Publications, during which time it would feature writers like Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, one of the future founders of DC. Adventure did 750 issues over 43 years, and would launch the career of T.S. Stribling with the story The Green Splotches on January 3rd of 1920, and he would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1933. The magazine also enjoyed a pretty famous fan base, which included former President Theodore Roosevelt. On November of 1935, the magazine celebrated its 25th anniversary, with Time magazine called it the number one pulp, while Newsweek deemed it the Adventure Pulp the dean of pulps. On April of 1953, the magazine was converted to a men's adventure magazine, where it would last until it was canceled in 1971. While many consider this the low point of adventure, it did publish stories from authors like Arthur C. Clarke, Armaments Race in April of 1954, and Norman Mailer with the Paper House in December of 1958. Of the other adventure pulps, Blue Book magazine, which ran 550 issues over 46 years, Short Stories ran for 450 issues for 44 years, Popular magazine went for 600 issues over 28 years, and Top Notch did 450 issues over 27 years. While fiction was the popular genre with adventure pulps, many also carried true stories. Children's Fiction House, Amazing Stories, Ned Pine's Thrilling Adventures, and Popular's Dynamic Adventures. In addition, many of the stories carried a sense of authenticity thanks to their writers, many of whom had first-hand experience in their tales, such as Captain A.E. Dingle, who was a sailor. The fiction stories covered everything from historical to fantasy, featuring such classic characters as Tarzan, Dr. Kildare, and Captain Horatio Hornblower, covering all subgenres of adventure pulps, from jungle to medicine to high seas adventure. Snappy Stories appeared in August of 1912 from William Clayton's New Fiction Publishing Company. This was cast as a lively and breezy pulp, soon to be followed by the Live Stories, Breezy Stories, and the La Parisienne. As time passed, these pulps would become more well-known for their risque content and covers, taking subjects such as adultery and premarital sex. By the 1920s, pulp covers started to spice up things as well. Westerns were another one of the more popular pulp genres, with 184 separate titles over a 40-year period, such as Indian stories, ranch romances, Northwest stories, and Civil War stories. Street and Smith produced Western Story magazine, and it was so popular it sold 500,000 copies in the 1920s. It evolved from New Buffalo Weekly in 1919. Western Story magazine first appeared on September 5th of 1919, launching the Western pulp genre and lasting to 1949. During its heyday, it was one of the most popular of the pulp magazines with a circulation of 500,000, and the magazine would attract numerous popular authors, noted as Max Brand, probably the most famous of his day. On December 25th of 1920, it featured his first story, Jerry Payton's Notched Inheritance, under the pseudonym George Owen Baxter, with editor Frank E. Blackwell. While popular, Brand considered his stories hack work, though wrote them to maintain his lifestyle, which by 1927 included a villa in Italy. Reportedly, he calculated how many pages he needed to do so, and once he learned it was 14 a day, Brand held that pace for years. He would later create MGM's Dr. James Kildare, which would command him a huge salary. The character first appeared in the slick Cosmopolitan, before it became the women's magazine Cosmo, on March of 1936. Western Stories magazine's slogan was Big Clean Stories of Western Life, a theme carried into the covers, which depicted scenes of herding cattle and mending fences over lynchings and scalpings. Fiction House would join the Western genre with Lariat Story magazine, featuring stories by Walter J. Coburn, and Doubleday would publish The Frontier and the West. The 1930s saw more realistic stories in Dime Western and Star Western, while expanding to the Canadian frontier with Far West stories and Northwest stories, where the Canadian Mounties substituted for the Texas Rangers. Of all the story writers, the most popular was Max Brand, a.k.a. Frederick Schiller Faust. He used multiple aliases throughout his career at Western Story magazine, such as George Owen Baxter, David Mance, John Friedrich, and Peter Henry Mallard. War stories appeared in slick magazines like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post. However, the Pulps would soon follow in magazines like Adventure, before specialized pulps like War Stories appeared in November of 1926 by Dell, birthing the war genre in pulps. War Stories focused on tales of World War I, then called the Great War, and Dell would soon follow up with war novels in February of 1928, Warbirds in March of 1928, Navy stories in February of 1929, submarine stories in April of 1929, and War Aces in April of 1930. Fawcett produced battle stories in September of 1927, focusing on World War II, and unlike Dell's books, featured more about the lives of the frontline soldiers over rollicking adventures. Battle Stories and another of Fawcett's pulps, XXX, featured covers by Jerome George Rowan and his brother George Jerome Rowan, who were twins and World War I veterans themselves. George served in the Signal Corps while Jerome was shipped to France, though he never saw combat. Jerome, who had been to the Louvre while in France, had a more extensive art education than his brother, delivered a more painterly style to his covers, while George's were more animated. Fiction House joined the war genre, along with capitalizing on the world's newfound love of aviation and producing Air Stories on April of 1927 and Wings of December of 1928, focused on aerial combat. 1928 also would see an explosion of air titles in general, much of it inspired by Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic and landing in France on May 21st of 1927, with other publishers producing pulps like Air Adventures by Clayton Magazines and Flying Aces by Magazine Publishers Incorporated. Like war pulps, many of these magazines sought out actual veterans as writers, like Arthur Gay Empty, who was a U.S. Cavalry veteran, or Arch Whitehouse, an RAF flyer. Robert J. Hogan would cross over the wall genre with the Hero One when he created G8, America's greatest flying spy, with the story G8 and his Battle Aces in October of 1933 from the popular publications. Detailing the adventures of Agent G8 and his faithful sidekicks, Bull Martin and Nippy Weston, they battled the forces of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, which included the Iron Mask Style Mask. With his success, Popular followed up with Robert Sidney Bowen and his Dusty Airs and his Battlebirds, who fought in a fugitive war against an Asiatic emperor. Even the more specialized pulps like Zeppelin stories and submarine stories were a staple of the war genre in 1929, but were ultimately as short-lived as their subjects. Of the great artists of pulps, N.C. Wyeth did the covers for popular magazines starting in 1909, along with a New Story magazine and All Around magazine through 1916. J.C. Leidendecker was a slick artist who found success in pulps as well, working on Popular from 1908 to 1911. Frank Schunwer, who, like Wyeth, was a student of the famed Howard Powell, did covers for Popular from 1913 to 1930, being exclusive to Street and Smith, as he did covers for People's Ideal magazine and Western Story magazine. Another student of Howard Powell was Harry Dunn, who also painted for Street and Smith from 1910 to 1915. Clinton Petty would work for Munsey and is most famous for painting the iconic covers of the October 1912 issue of All Story magazine, which featured the story of Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Patrick J. P.J. Monahan worked mostly for Munsey, while Frederick Small also was exclusive from 1912 to 1922, becoming well known for his early work in fantasy and science fiction covers. Many of these popular pulps featured stories by classic writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs, creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, Max Brand, creator of Dr. Kildare, Clarence E. Mulford, creator of Hopalong Cassidy, and Johnstone Macaulay, creator of Zorro. Johnston Macaulay was born on February 2, 1883, in Ottawa, Illinois. He began his career as a police office reporter for the Police Gazette and later served as an Army Public Affairs officer during World War I. He would later work in Pulps, creating numerous heroes that would later inspire the mass superheroes in comic books. The most famous was Zorro, who first appeared in the story of The Curse of Capistrano in 1919 in All Story Weekly. The character was a mass vigilante Zorro set in Pueblo of Los Angeles during the Spanish California, which took place between 1769 and 1821. His real identity was Don Diego de la Vega, a rich landowner. Of course, Zorro would go on to be a popular fictional character in his own right, with numerous TV shows, movies, and comic books based on him, but he was also a chief inspiration for one of comic books' greatest characters, Batman. According to Batman's co-creator Bob Kane, he was a huge fan of Zorro and drew heavy inspiration from him when crafting Batman. Kane would point out the obvious similarities, which them both being rich playboys while fighting crime as masked vigilantes dressed in black, complete with expert acrobatic and combat skills. They both even had a secret lair in a cave under their mansion. Macaulay would also create other masked vigilantes in pulps like the Thunderbolt, Crimson Cowl, and Black Star. He even created a supervillain in the Spider, all of whom would serve as inspiration for future comic book superheroes. Macaulay passed away on November 23, 1958 at the age of 75 in Los Angeles, California. His creation Zorro remains as popular as ever, outshining him to the point that many have forgotten that he is a writer and that Zorro originally started as a pulp character. For the color artist, Walter Baumhofer was also known as the King of Pulps, most famous for his Doc Savage covers. He started with the Danger Trail, providing his first covers and interior art. Another of the pulp writers was Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was born on September 1st of 1875 in Chicago, Illinois. After serving in the U.S. Cavalry and enlisting in spring of 1896, he went through numerous failed careers, despite having to support a wife and 3 children. Thus, at the age of 37, he submitted Under the Moon of Mars about a Southern American Civil War veteran who finds himself transported to Mars, where he encounters the 4-armed, 8-foot-tall Green Man while falling in love with Dejah Doris, the Princess of Mars, while fighting to save her kingdom and fighting off barbarian invaders. He even has super strength and leaping abilities thanks to Mars' lower gravity, something that would inspire the original creation of Superman, who at first just leaped tall buildings in a single bound before he learned to fly. The story first appeared in All Story magazine on February-July of 1912 and was greeted a huge success. Burroughs followed with Tarzan of the Apes, appearing in All Story in October of 1912, about the son of an English lord raised as a baby by apes in the African jungle after her parents were killed. The rest was history, and soon Burroughs was the highest-paid writer in the world, earning thousands of dollars off the sequels of his works. He would soon be known as ERB, and with his new fortune, Burroughs started his own publishing company, Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, profiting from the 1930s and 40s off both his new books and reprints of the originals. Burroughs then moved to California in 1918, purchasing a large ranch in the San Fernando Valley, which he aptly named Tarzana. A few years later, he broke up the ranch into subdivisions, selling the property in sections that will eventually become the town Tarzana. Burroughs would later create a third character, David Enns, who traveled beneath the earth and would even cross over with Tarzan and Tarzan at the Earth's core, a crossover before comic books ever did it. Burroughs would next create Carson Napier, who crash lands on Venus, finding himself captured by pirates while trying to get back to Earth, first appearing in the pulp Argosy in 1934. Burroughs' stories were also published in pulps like Amazing Stories and Fantastic Adventures, and he was so popular with readers that his name on the cover guaranteed 15,000 in extras issues sales. In addition, his characters were an enormous influence for both writers and storytellers, as John Carter was also a chief influence for Star Wars as well as Superman. When Burroughs' novels were later reprinted in 1962, it resulted in $10 million in sales, representing 1/30th of all paperback sales of that year. Edgar Rice Burroughs died in March of 1950 at the age of 74, with his final resting place naturally being in Tarzana, California. Today, he is remembered as one of the greatest science fiction and adventure writers of all time, and no less than Ray Bradbury calling him one of the most influential writers in the entire history of the world. The mystery genre of pulps began in Detective Story magazine from Street and Smith, published on October 5th of 1915. The first magazine dedicated to mystery stories. The magazine evolved out of Nick Carter's stories, which was the original nickel weekly pamphlet with a novel-length feature as its main attraction. Bumping the page count to 128 to be in line with the rest of Pulps, Detective Story magazine was edited by Frankie Blackwell, who preferred Poe-like stories, many written by Johnston McCulley. Many of Detective's covers were by John Albert Coughlin for the first 2 decades, though the painter, who also worked for slicks like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post, was rather boring. The magazine lasted to the summer of 1949 with a run of 1,057 issues and is mostly known for its straight mystery stories. This would all change for the genre with Black Mask, which emphasized the hard-boiled stories from writers like Raymond Chandler in Blackmailers Don't Shoot in December of 1933. Chandler, who was a former oil executive who was 44-year-old when he submitted the story, soon changed the detective genre. Black Mask was originally covered many other genres such as adventure and westerns before going all the detective stories in 1932. The pulp began back in April of 1920 under Joseph T. Shaw, George G. Nathan, and H.L. Mencken. Nathan and Mencken were editors of Smart Set, a high-tone magazine with lofty intentions but low sales. But they had also managed to produce some money with racier pulps like The Parisian and Saucy Stories. With the success of those pulps, they decided to add a third, being Black Mask, which originally covered all kinds of stories from adventure to romance. By the end of the year, Nathan and Mencken sold Black Mask for $12,500 after their original $600 investment, and under the new leadership, it would change along with the detective genre in general. In Volume 5, Number 9, on December of 1922, hard-boiled detective fiction with stories like False Bottom Combs about a gentleman adventurer assigned to protect a rich man's son by Carol John Daly, and The Roadhouse, detective in which a detective is tasked with taking a criminal from the Central American jungles back to New York by Peter Collinson, a.k.a. Dashiell Hammett, whose first ever published story appeared in the Smart Set just 2 months earlier. Both stories featured tough talk and fast action over character and story, and the lead character who lives his life by his own rules, which would become the hallmark of hard-boiled detective stories. Race Williams, the gentleman adventurer of False Button Combs, would be a frequent star of the daily stories, often addressing the reader directly with tough-talking observations and philosophy. Hammett, of course, would go on to write the classic The Thin Man and the Maltese Falcon stories, considered modern classics in the detective fiction genre. Between these two, they set an example that changed detective stories from just mystery-solving puzzles to character and atmosphere that has carried on to this day. Look no further than Frank Miller's Sin City as an example. Black Mask would run until 1951, and its legacy of hard-boiled crime fiction remains to this day. In fact, the working title of Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, the classic film that embodied numerous hard-boiled crime stories, was called Black Mask as in honor of the magazine that inspired the genre of storytelling. Another detective series was Flynn Weekly, which later became Flynn's Weekly Detective Fiction, emphasized traditional mysteries over the hard-boiled ones in Black Mask. Soon, subgenres in pulps would spring up, such as Underworld magazine in May of 1927, the first gang pulp. It would be followed by Gunballs, Greater Gangster Stories, and the Dragnet magazine. However, by 1935, this subgenre fizzled with the end of Prohibition and much of the gang warfare that went with it. The sports genre was another significant, though not as big, set of pulp magazines, such as Dime Sports, which started in July of 1935, 2 months after the legendary Babe Ruth ended his baseball career, and it would run to 1944 with 1,054 issues. It would be preceded by Sports Story magazine, which was released only twice monthly and began back in 1923. The pulp featured fiction and nonfiction stories before regular sports magazines, while the covers were more realistic and emotional. Sports Story enjoyed virtual dominance in the market until Dime Sports was published, leading to an onslaught of sports pulps, including news sports and sports novels. Ultimately, sports would not be as successful as other pulp genres, with most of the readers being young boys who eventually grew out of the stories. Plus, due to its content, neither the stories nor the covers were as exciting or fantastical as the other genres, such as horror or science fiction. Street and Smith did produce Sports Story, which ran for 429 issues until 1943 and would cover all sports at first. However, by 1930s, it focused mainly on baseball and football and would feature authors like Max Brand, Robert E. Howard, and the creator of Conan the Barbarian. Romance pulps would tie with westerns as one of the most popular in the genre, running from 1912 to 1971, with 139 separate titles and as many as 20 being published at one time. A notable one was Love Story magazine in 1921 by Street and Smith, and by 1929 it reached 600,000 in sales before ending in 1947. By 1938, there were 19 romance titles along with 11 Western romance titles like Love Book Magazine, Popular Love, Thrilling Love, and 1924's Ranch Romances, which is a new sub-crossover genre with Westerns. The covers and the stories will evolve over time from the 1920s featuring meek women till by the late 30s they were employed strong women. In the 1940s, as part of World War II, many of the women were depicted in uniform on the cover. Some of the covers were more risque for the time, whether depicting a woman in a passionate kiss with a man or laying allurely on a grassy field, but never straying too far lest they would be labeled as spicy or sexy pulp, i.e. softcore porn. Modest Stein did nearly every cover for Love Story, with especially being beautiful women. Female artists were especially prevalent in this romance genre, with some notable ones being Madge Geyer, Gloria Stoll, and Zena Wright. However, they weren't just artists but also editors, as with Daisy Bacon, who edited Love Story magazine from 1928 to 1947, originally getting a job answering an ad for an editorial assistant in February of 1926. She was first put in charge of the Friends in Need advice column, with numerous others she read from Love Story's readers giving her insight into what stories they liked. By 1928, Bacon was made editor and quickly gained a reputation for knowing what the readers wanted from the experience. Under Bacon, the Love Story magazine focused on modern working girls who found love during their story, but not at the sacrifice of the story itself. In fact, Bacon stated a good love story doesn't necessarily need the romance element. Outspoken in public, Bacon could be considered a feminist for her time, as he frequently spoke to newspapers about women's issues and the inability to shatter the glass ceiling in pursuit of their careers. Bacon's sister Esther would join her on Love Story in 1929 until it ended in 1947. While at Street and Smith, Bacon also edited The Shadow, Doc Savage, Smart Love Stories, and Detective Stories before publishing company ended Pulps altogether. Bacon later published Love Story Writer in 1954, a guide on how to write a romance story. She died in 1986 at the age of 87, leaving behind a legacy of one of the most talented writers and editors of the pulp era. And I will leave you here for now, but join me again next week when we continue in this history of pulp magazines, covering the other genres is horror, science fiction, and of course the one that will have a heavy influence on American comic books, the hero genre. And now it is February 19th, 2026, time for the favorite comic book of the week. Ultimate Spider-Man number 24 by Jonathan Hickman, Marco Cecchetto, and David Messina, which wraps up this fantastic series in the new Ultimate Universe as Spider-Man brings the fight to Kingpin and Mr. Negative, while also having a nice flashback to how him and MJ's relationship really started up. This is a great series, an issue that wraps up the main story arc of this series, along with also kind of setting up things for the future, which maybe if Marvel gets their head straight and realize, oh wait, this is making us a lot of money, why don't we continue this series? But if not, we had a great 24 issue 2-year run, fantastic work all around, great show that, oh wait, Peter Parker and Mary Jane do work great together, and them being married and having kids, fantastic storylines. Also, Richard, his son, have a great story arc too, with a certain black cat that makes up for a lot of fun. And Cecchetto's art is gorgeous, highly detailed, especially the action sequences as Spider-Man, Kingpin, and Mr. Negative fight. And also David Messina gets thrown in here as well to help with the more personal side, which always, as you know, Messina's been the one who fills in for Cecchetto when he couldn't the art because his art is super highly detailed, but he focuses on more personal stuff, which he's great at. He does a great job with those scenes, especially the flashback scenes where we see the beginning of Peter and MJ's relationship, and it's just everything's just pitch perfect. Just a great reach from beginning to end. Easily one of the best runs of any Spider-Man story in years, and hopefully it gets continued one day. And if not, maybe the 616 will wise up and realize, oh wait, Peter and MJ, they belong together. Get them back together. But till then, we have this one great series that is definitely worth reading. And with that will conclude this episode of the Archive. Join me again next week for the part 2 of the Archive edition of the Pulp's history. And go enjoy this super good comic book. And definitely go back and read all of Ultimate Spider-Man this last run. Best run of Spider-Man in years.